This is my true story. I gave my whole life to my son. I worked from morning till night just to feed him, to give him a roof, to make sure he never suffered the way I did. I thought when I grew old, he would stand beside me with pride. But I was wrong. One night, he threw me out, said I was too old, too useless. I slept on a park bench while he laughed with his friends as they walked by. That pain nearly broke me. But it also changed me. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. The night I was thrown out still lives in my mind like a wound that never closes. I remember standing at the door, holding a small bag with a few clothes, my son's voice echoing behind me, cold and final. I didn't fight back. There was no strength left in me to argue. I walked into the dark streets, the house lights fading behind me, knowing that the home I built with my own hands no longer had space for me. That night, I found a wooden bench in the park. The wind was sharp, the ground cold, and I had no blanket, only an old coat that barely kept me warm. I pulled it tighter and looked up at the sky, asking why a father's love always ends with silence. Every noise scared me. The footsteps of strangers, the cars passing, the sound of dogs barking in the distance. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. The cold cut through my bones, and the memories burned worse. I thought about the days when that same son would hold my hand across the street, the nights when I'd stay awake to make sure he had dinner ready before his exams. Every sacrifice, every drop of sweat, every unpaid meal to keep him fed, all of it ended with one sentence: "You're a burden." Morning came, and the sunlight didn't feel like hope. It felt like exposure. People walked by pretending they didn't see me. Some looked with pity, others with disgust. I could feel their eyes judging me, wondering what mistake had brought me here. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't lazy, I wasn't a criminal. I was just a father who had outlived his usefulness. My body ached, but the ache inside was worse. Hunger clawed at me, but it wasn't food I wanted. It was dignity. Days passed like that. I found corners of the city to rest in, small shelters that smelled of hopelessness. At night, I'd return to the same bench. It became my home, my punishment, and my teacher. The world around me moved fast, people laughing, rushing to work, living their lives, while I sat still, invisible. I had nothing left except memories, and even those began to hurt. Every time I thought of my son, a part of me wished I could forget his face, but love is cruel like that. It makes you remember even when it destroys you. One evening, rain started to fall. The drops hit the metal bench like tiny hammers. I tried to cover my head with my bag, but it was useless. The rain soaked through everything, my clothes, my shoes, my spirit. I sat there shivering, teeth clenched, watching the world blur through the downpour. I thought maybe this was how I'd die, cold, forgotten, alone. But a small voice inside me said no. Not like this, not broken. Not while he still believed he had the right to laugh at me. That voice became a fire. It burned through the shame, through the pain, through the years of silence. I realized I had spent my whole life giving, and now, for once, I had to take something back. Not revenge, not anger, just respect. The kind that isn't handed out but earned, quietly and painfully. That night, I promised myself one thing. I would never let anyone see me as weak again. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I would stand tall. I would rebuild from nothing, even if it took the rest of my life. Because if my son could throw me away like garbage, then I would rise as proof that what's thrown away can still become gold. And so, as the rain stopped and the sun rose again, I sat up straighter on that bench. I wiped the water from my face, tightened my coat, and whispered to myself, "It starts today." I didn't have money. I didn't have shelter. But I had something far stronger, a will made of everything that pain couldn't kill. It happened a few weeks later. I was still living on that same park bench, the same wooden seat that had become my bed, my dining table, and my only witness. My hair had grown messy, my clothes smelled of dust and rain, and my face showed the weight of every sleepless night. I sat quietly, eating a piece of stale bread someone had handed me earlier that morning, when I saw a familiar car stop across the street. The sound of laughter came first, light and careless, the kind of laughter only people without worries have. Then I saw him, my son, my own flesh and blood, stepping out of that car dressed in fine clothes, surrounded by his friends, holding a cup of coffee as if life had never hurt him. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe he had come for me. Maybe he had realized how cruel he had been. Maybe there was still some part of him that remembered who built the roof over his head. But then his eyes met mine, and what I saw in them wasn't love. It was mockery. A smirk spread across his face, slow, deliberate, filled with pride. He pointed at me and said something to his friends. They all turned, laughing, shaking their heads, looking at me like I was a joke. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. Words like failure and beggar. My heart stopped. That moment felt like a blade cutting deep into my chest. My son, the same boy who once cried on my shoulder after his first heartbreak, now laughed at me as if I were a stranger in the dirt. He didn't see the father who fed him, taught him, protected him. He only saw an old man on a bench, worthless, forgotten, beneath him. I wanted to stand, to shout, to ask him why, but the words wouldn't come. My throat locked, my hands trembled. I just sat there, staring, as he and his friends walked away, still laughing, still proud of their cruelty. That night, I didn't sleep. The laughter stayed in my head, echoing over and over again until it hurt more than hunger ever could. I looked at my reflection in a puddle beside the bench, my beard unshaven, my eyes hollow. And for the first time, I didn't recognize myself. I wasn't just poor, I was invisible. And the worst part was knowing that the person who made me feel that way was my own son. But something changed in me that night. I stopped crying. The tears had no meaning anymore. The pain had gone so deep that it turned into something else. Something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. If he could laugh at me for being weak, then I would give him a reason to fear what strength really looks like. I told myself that the next time he saw me, I wouldn't be sitting on a bench. I wouldn't be begging. I would be standing taller than he could ever imagine. I started walking that very night. My legs ached, my stomach growled, but I walked anyway, walked until the pain became background noise. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew what I was leaving behind. I wasn't running from humiliation. I was walking through it, using it as fuel. Because humiliation, when you let it burn long enough, becomes power. Every cruel laugh, every cruel word, I carried them with me, not as scars, but as reminders. They became my reason to keep moving, to prove that the same man they mocked on the street could rise higher than anyone expected. As the city lights dimmed behind me, I made myself another promise. I would rise not out of hate, but out of discipline. Because hate fades, but discipline builds empires. And someday, when he looked at me again, he wouldn't see a man to laugh at. He'd see the man he could never be. That night after my son's laughter echoed through the streets, I sat on that cold bench with nothing left inside me except pain. Not just the pain of hunger or loneliness. Those I had already learned to live with. This was deeper. It was the kind of pain that comes when love turns into something cruel, when someone you gave everything to looks at you and sees nothing. I stared at my shaking hands and thought about every time I'd carried him in my arms, every time I skipped my own meals so he could eat. I had worked all my life for one dream, to see my son live better than I ever did. And now that dream was spitting in my face. The streets grew quiet. The sky turned darker. I listened to the sound of my own breathing, uneven, shallow, tired. My chest felt heavy, but I didn't cry. I was past tears. There's a moment when pain grows so strong it stops hurting. It just becomes a part of you, something you wear like skin. That's what I felt. The laughter, the rejection, the humiliation. They didn't crush me anymore. They hardened me. I thought of my wife, long gone, and what she would say if she saw me like this. She always told me that kindness has limits, that if you give too much without being valued, people start to think you owe them more. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had spoiled my son with too much comfort, too much sacrifice. I gave him everything: food, education, money, but never taught him the one thing that matters: respect. And now, he treated me like garbage because I had never made him earn what he was given. That realization burned worse than the cold wind. I pulled my coat tighter, leaned against the bench, and closed my eyes. I could hear people in the distance, music, laughter, car horns, the sound of a city that didn't care. And that's when something inside me broke, not in weakness, but in clarity. I finally understood that no one was coming to save me. No one owed me kindness. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to rise again, I had to start from zero. Alone. That thought scared me, but it also gave me strength. Pain stopped being my enemy. It became my engine. I began to see it for what it was, a reminder that I was still alive, that I still had fight left in me. If my son could laugh at my suffering, then I would turn that suffering into power. I wouldn't just recover. I would rebuild. Brick by brick, with the same hands that built his future. I started talking to myself softly, like a soldier preparing for war. "You've worked harder before," I whispered. "You've built a life from nothing once. You can do it again." My voice trembled, but I believed it. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous in the best way. Because when a man has already fallen as low as he can go, the only direction left is up. As the first light of morning crept over the park, I stood up. My legs were weak, but my heart felt stronger than it had in years. I looked at the bench one last time, the place that held my tears, my shame, my turning point, and I made a silent promise. I would come back one day, not to sleep, not to beg, but to stand tall and remember the man I became because of that pain. Pain, I realized, doesn't destroy everyone. Sometimes it forges you. It takes everything soft inside you and turns it into something unbreakable. And that's exactly what it did to me. The next morning, I woke up with nothing but determination. My stomach growled, my body ached, but my mind was clear. I knew I couldn't stay on that bench another night. If I stayed, I'd die there, not just from hunger, but from giving up. So, I started walking. My shoes were worn, my clothes smelled of the street, but I walked anyway. Every step hurt, but I told myself each one was taking me away from weakness. I had no destination, just one goal: survive today, then fight again tomorrow. I walked until my legs felt like stone. When I passed by a small warehouse near the city's edge, I saw men working, unloading boxes, cleaning trucks, carrying heavy goods. I stood there, watching. My clothes were torn, my face unshaven, but I walked up anyway. I asked for work. The foreman looked at me, suspicious, then said they didn't need help. I didn't move. I told him I'd work for food, not money. Maybe he saw something in my eyes, because after a long pause, he pointed to a broom and said, "Start with that." So I did. That was my first job after losing everything: sweeping floors, cleaning the trucks, scrubbing the oil stains from the ground. My hands blistered, my back screamed, but I didn't complain. Every drop of sweat was a promise to myself. Every broom stroke was a step away from that bench. The other workers laughed sometimes, called me the old man who never stops. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I knew what I was building, even if they didn't. Days turned into weeks. I showed up before sunrise and left after dark. I never missed a day. I learned everything I could: how the trucks ran, where the deliveries went, how the money flowed. I asked questions quietly and listened more than I spoke. The owner, an old friend I hadn't seen in years, noticed my work. One day, he called me into his office. He didn't recognize me at first. I had aged so much from the struggle. But when he did, he was shocked. He offered me more hours, better pay, and soon I was helping manage the deliveries instead of sweeping around them. That's when everything started to change. I saved every penny. I didn't waste a single coin. While others spent their wages on drinks and distractions, I kept mine tucked away. I ate simple meals, bread, rice, water, and worked through the nights. Every extra shift was another wall built, another piece of the life I was rebuilding. Slowly, painfully, I was climbing again. Then one day, opportunity knocked. A company needed independent truckers for local contracts. Small deals, but consistent ones. My boss said it wasn't worth it, but I saw something different. I borrowed a small amount from him, promising to pay it back in 6 months. With that money, I bought an old truck that could barely run. I fixed it myself, every nut and bolt, every scratch and dent. That truck became my new home, my new chance. I worked non-stop. Rain, heat, sickness, nothing stopped me. I drove day and night, delivering goods, building connections, earning trust. Within a year, I paid off the loan and bought 2 more trucks. Then 5, then 10. By the second year, I wasn't just another worker. I was a business owner. My small delivery company grew fast, fueled by my hunger to prove that I was more than what they thought. And I never forgot that park bench. It stayed in my mind as both a scar and a reminder. Every time I felt tired, I pictured myself lying there, cold and broken, and it pushed me harder. The same pain that almost killed me was now driving me to live. That was the start, not just of a business, but of my rebirth. I had fallen, been laughed at, and left to rot. But I rose again, not for revenge, but to prove that dignity doesn't die in the dirt. It rises with those who refuse to stay down. The rise didn't happen overnight. It came slow, through long days and sleepless nights, through pain that turned into persistence. I worked like a man possessed, not because I wanted wealth, but because I wanted to prove I was still worth something. I wasn't building a business. I was rebuilding my soul. Every contract I signed, every delivery I made, every client I satisfied was one more brick in the wall between the man who once slept on a bench and the man I was becoming. Soon, word began to spread. People said there was an old man running his company like clockwork, never missing a deadline, never cheating a customer. They didn't know my story. They only saw results. I didn't tell them about the nights I spent fixing broken engines under streetlights or the mornings I drove for 12 hours without rest. I just worked, silently, letting my effort speak. My first warehouse was a rusted building with cracked windows. My office was a folding chair and a borrowed desk. But I treated it like a palace because it was built from pain and earned through honor. Within a year, I hired more drivers. Most of them were men like me, the ones nobody respected, the ones society forgot. I gave them steady jobs, fair pay, food on the table. They worked hard because they saw I worked harder. Some called me boss. I never corrected them, but inside, I smiled. Not because I liked the title, but because it reminded me how far I'd come. The same man who was once called a burden was now giving others a reason to wake up in the morning. 2 years later, I signed my first big deal, a logistics contract worth more money than I had ever seen. I didn't celebrate, I didn't buy fancy clothes or move into a mansion. I sat in my small office that night, staring at the papers, remembering every drop of rain that fell on that park bench. I whispered a quiet thank you to the version of myself who never gave up, even when no one believed in him. The business grew faster than I expected. I started investing carefully. 1 truck became 10, 10 became 50. I bought land, built new warehouses, expanded routes across cities. By the end of the second year, my company was worth over $5 million. People started calling me "Sir" in meetings, offering me their hands with forced smiles, pretending they respected me. But I knew the truth. They respected what I built, not who I was. Still, I accepted it. I didn't need their validation. My dignity was already restored the day I stood on my own 2 feet again. Sometimes I drove past the park where it all started. The bench was still there. Different people sat on it now, the homeless, the tired, the forgotten. I'd park nearby and leave food under the seat. No one knew it was me, and I didn't want them to. I just wanted to make sure no one else felt the same kind of hunger I did. The bench wasn't just a memory, it was my foundation. That wooden seat carried me through my lowest point, and I carried its lesson forever. Never depend on the same hands that can throw you away. But through all that success, I never spoke to my son. Not once. I didn't hate him anymore, but I didn't forgive him either. He became a ghost in my story, a shadow I didn't chase. I knew life had its own way of bringing people full circle. It always does. And one day, when it did, I wanted him to see me not as the father he left behind, but as the man he could never be. The rise wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. Respect for myself, for what I'd endured, for what I built when the world called me nothing. I had turned my humiliation into empire, my sorrow into strength. I wasn't the man on the bench anymore. I was the man who owned the street it stood on. After everything I built, I still stayed silent. I didn't reach out to my son. I didn't call him, didn't send a message, didn't even ask how he was doing. The same silence he once gave me when he turned his back was now the wall I built between us. I could have told him about my success, could have shown him what I became, but I didn't. Some lessons in life aren't taught through words, they're taught through absence. I let him live with the version of me he thought was gone, weak, finished. The world didn't need to know I had risen. It was enough that I knew. There were nights when I sat in my office after everyone left, the lights dim, the air quiet. I'd look at the city skyline from the window and think of him. Not with hate, not even with sadness. Just with a hollow kind of peace. He made his choice. And that choice gave me the strength I never knew I had. I realized something in that silence. Sometimes losing people isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of the one that truly matters. My silence wasn't punishment, it was freedom. But silence has its own voice. It speaks in strange ways. People who once ignored you start to whisper your name again. Those who looked down on you start to look up. I began hearing rumors. My son had lost his job, his wife had left, his debts were growing. Life, it seemed, had started to return its lessons. I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. Pain is still pain, even when it falls on those who caused yours. I just sat there, quiet as always, watching how time evened the score without me having to lift a finger. My company kept growing. I hired more people, expanded to more cities. Every day I met hundreds of faces, and yet I felt alone in the best way. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the kind that gives you peace because you finally know your worth. I'd sit in meetings where people treated me with respect, and I'd think about how far I had come. The same world that once laughed now listened when I spoke. The same people who once turned their faces away now sought my advice. Still, I never boasted. My workers only knew me as the boss who never talks about himself. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. My story wasn't about revenge, it was about redemption. I wasn't chasing anyone's approval. I had already earned something far greater. Self-respect. Sometimes, when I passed by the mirror in my office, I'd see my reflection, older, grayer, tougher. I'd stare for a moment and whisper softly, "You did it." But I also knew something else. Success feels empty if you fill it with anger. So I let go. I forgave my son in silence, even if he never asked. I forgave him not for him, but for myself, because carrying hate is just another kind of burden, and I was done carrying anything that dragged me down. Years passed, and my silence grew louder. It became my shield. People asked about my family, and I'd only smile. There was nothing to say. My story wasn't about who left me. It was about who I became after they did. I learned to find comfort in solitude, to see value in discipline, and to build peace out of ruins. But silence, as strong as it is, doesn't last forever. Life always finds a way to circle back. And when it does, it doesn't knock politely. It barges in. One morning, I walked into my office like any other day, coffee in hand, ready to review files. My secretary came in with a stack of papers and said softly, "There's a new applicant for the operations department, sir. You might want to see this one." I took the file and read the name on the top. My hands stopped. My breath caught in my throat. It was my son. I stared at the file for a long time, the letters of his name blurring in front of my eyes. My son. The same boy who once laughed while I shivered on a park bench. the same voice that called me useless, the same hands that pushed me away. For a moment, I thought it was some cruel joke, maybe a coincidence, but it wasn't. His full name, his signature, his handwriting, it was all there. My blood ran cold. Life, in its strange way, had brought him right to my door. 2 years ago, he had taken away my dignity. Now, he was asking me for a job. I sat back in my chair, holding that file like it weighed 100 pounds. My secretary spoke again, saying he was in the lobby waiting to be interviewed. I didn't answer at first. My mind was full. Not of anger, not even of revenge, but of disbelief. This was the same man who laughed at my pain, who turned away when I needed him most, now sitting outside, desperate, hoping for a chance to work in my company. The company I built from nothing, from hunger, from humiliation. I opened the file. His resume was polished but hollow. Short-term jobs, failed ventures, gaps in employment. The arrogance that once filled his words was gone. Every line on that paper screamed struggle. He had fallen hard. The kind of fall only pride can cause. My chest tightened. I wanted to feel satisfied, to feel like justice had been served. But all I felt was quiet. Life had already done what I never could. It humbled him. For a long moment, I just sat there, thinking back to that bench. I could still see his face, laughing with his friends while I sat cold and hungry. I remembered how I promised myself that one day I'd rise again, not to destroy him, but to show him what real strength looked like. And now that moment had come, uninvited, wrapped in irony. I told my secretary to send him in. My voice didn't shake, but my heart did. As I waited, I looked around my office, the polished desk, the framed awards, the company logo on the wall. Everything here was mine, earned with pain he could never imagine. I wondered if he'd recognize that this empire was built on the same back he once laughed at. The door opened slowly. He stepped in, wearing a cheap suit, holding a folder, his eyes heavy, his smile forced. He didn't look like the proud man I once knew. He looked smaller somehow, thinner, quieter, defeated. He glanced around the room, admiring the office, unaware of who was sitting behind the desk. And then our eyes met. The moment he saw me, his face froze. The color drained from his cheeks. The folder slipped slightly in his hand. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I watched the realization crash over him like a wave. The truth that the man he once mocked now owned the company he was begging to join. For a second, the silence between us felt endless. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything that needed saying was written on his face. The regret, the guilt, the shame. He tried to smile, tried to say something polite, but the words stumbled out like broken glass. I could see him fighting back tears, pretending to be professional, pretending this was just another job interview. But I saw the boy beneath the man, scared, lost, and full of regret. He asked softly for a chance, said things had been hard, that he'd changed. His voice trembled the same way mine once did when I asked him for understanding. I let him talk, not to punish him, but because I wanted him to hear his own words, the desperation, the pleading, the same helplessness I once felt when he turned me away. In that moment, I didn't feel hate. I felt something worse, pity, because I realized that no punishment I could give him would ever match what life had already done. Pride had taken everything from him. His comfort, his family, his peace. And now, here he was, standing in front of me, asking for a chance in the world he once said I'd never belong to. And that was the twist of fate. The day the man who once mocked me on a park bench walked into my office, humbled, broken, and ready to beg. He stood there in silence for a few seconds, trying to find words that would make the moment less heavy. His hands shook as he held that folder, his eyes darting around the office like he was looking for an escape. But there was none. This was the same man who once walked past me without a glance, the same son who laughed as I froze on that park bench. And now, he was the one standing, while I sat behind the desk he never thought I could own. Life had taken a full circle, but instead of pride, all I felt was an emptiness that even victory couldn't fill. He finally spoke, his voice soft, uncertain, cracking between each word. He said he was looking for work, that things hadn't gone as planned, that he was just trying to get back on his feet. He didn't dare call me Dad. He said, "Sir." And that single word cut through the air like a knife. The first time in my life my son called me that. Not out of love, not out of respect, but out of need. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that once lived in mine when I begged for his understanding. I opened the folder he'd brought. His resume was shorter than I expected. A few small jobs here and there, some unpaid debts, nothing steady. The confidence that once fueled his every word was gone. I looked at him for a long time, my hands resting on the paper, and then back at the boy I once raised. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than a second. His pride had been stripped away, leaving only the man life had beaten down. I didn't speak for a while. I wanted him to feel the same silence he gave me when I stood outside his house years ago, begging him to let me stay. That same silence that felt like a door closing forever. I wanted him to understand what it means when someone looks at you and says nothing, not because they don't care, but because you're not worth the breath. But as I looked at him, trembling, ashamed, I realized something. Revenge wouldn't fix anything. The past couldn't be undone. But lessons could still be taught. So I asked him one question. "Do you remember the bench?" His head snapped up. His lips parted slightly, his eyes widened. For a second he tried to act confused, but the memory hit him. I saw it. The flash of guilt, the horror of realizing that I remembered every moment of that night. He looked down again, unable to speak. I continued, my voice calm but steady. "You laughed that night. Do you remember?" His shoulders sank. He nodded slightly. He tried to say something, maybe an apology, but no words came out. I could see the tears forming in his eyes, the same eyes that once looked at me with disgust. I told him that pain doesn't break a man, it builds him if he lets it. I told him that respect isn't about power or money, it's about gratitude, something he had never learned. He nodded through tears, whispering that he was sorry. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to see the boy I once loved, not the man who threw me away. But time had changed us both. I wasn't the same father he left behind. I was harder now, colder, but also wiser. I stood up, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of him. I could see his hands trembling, his chest rising fast, like a child waiting to be scolded. He whispered again, "Dad, please, just a chance." That word, Dad, sounded broken, like it didn't belong in his mouth anymore. I looked at him for a long time, and all I said was, "I know you didn't know." He nodded, wiping his tears, thinking maybe that was forgiveness. But it wasn't. It was closure. The kind that doesn't heal, only ends. I walked back to my desk, placed his file down, and said nothing more. The silence returned, but this time, it was mine. For years, he had ignored my pain. Now, life made him feel his own. The same bench where I once slept had turned into a chair of power, and the same son who laughed at me now stood there, begging for a chance he no longer deserved. He stood there, frozen in front of my desk, his head lowered, the folder still clutched in his hands like a lifeline that was slipping away. I could see the tears beginning to form in his eyes, but he tried hard to hide them. He wasn't the proud young man I remembered. He was hollow now, a man stripped bare by the same arrogance that once made him laugh at my pain. I didn't take pleasure in it. I didn't smile or gloat. I just looked at him, calm and steady, because I wanted him to understand something deeper than words. That pride built on disrespect always collapses, and when it does, it crushes harder than any fall from wealth. I reached across the table, took the folder from his hands, and opened it again. I didn't need to read it. I had already seen enough. There were words like terminated, resigned, incomplete. Every job he had ever held ended badly. I closed the file slowly and set it down. He looked at me, waiting for some kind of answer, a yes, a no, anything. But I stayed quiet for a moment, letting the silence weigh heavy between us. Then I said, You laughed when I had nothing. You turned your back when I needed a hand. You looked at me like I was beneath you. His shoulders started shaking. He tried to speak, but I continued. Now, you're the one standing where I was. You're the one asking. And I need you to understand that this moment, isn't revenge. It's life showing you the cost of arrogance. He began to cry openly. His voice cracked as he said he was sorry, that he didn't know, that he was young and stupid. I listened, but I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not satisfaction, just peace. Because finally, he was seeing the truth I had lived with for years, that disrespecting someone who built your foundation only leads to your own destruction. He looked up again and said, Dad, please, I'll do anything. I shook my head. You had everything, I said softly, and you threw it away. I told him that I didn't build this company with anger. I built it with pain, patience, and discipline. Every brick in the walls of that office carried a piece of the suffering he once mocked. I told him that when a man loses everything, he either breaks or becomes unbreakable, and I chose the second. He lowered his head again, ashamed. He said he would work hard, that he didn't need a big salary, that he just wanted a chance. But I knew better. A man who only learns humility through desperation hasn't really changed. He's just scared. I didn't want his fear, I wanted his understanding. But that couldn't be taught here, not like this. I told him something I had learned in the hardest way possible, that life doesn't punish cruel people immediately. It waits. It lets them rise, lets them laugh, lets them think they've won. Then, when the time is right, it takes everything away, piece by piece, until they're left with nothing but their reflection. That's when they remember the faces of the people they stepped on to get there. He cried harder. The sound filled the office, raw and broken. I didn't move. I didn't offer him comfort. Because comfort would have been cruelty. Sometimes the most painful lessons are the only ones that stick. He needed to feel the weight of every word he once threw at me, the same way I had felt them echoing in my chest as I slept under open skies. Finally, I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. The same streets where I once begged for food now carried my company's trucks, my name, my effort. I turned back to him and said, You wanted to see what success looks like. It looks like this, not money, not buildings, but dignity. The one thing you lose when you think you're better than the people who raised you. He didn't look up. He just nodded slowly, wiping his tears. I could see him understanding, maybe for the first time, what it means to destroy love with pride. Then I said quietly, You can go now. He froze for a second, realizing what those words meant. He whispered one last, I'm sorry, before walking out of the office. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, the same sound I remembered from the night he walked away from me years ago. Only this time, it wasn't me who was broken. It was him. When he left my office, the door closed softly behind him, but the silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard. I stood there, still looking at the spot where he had been standing just moments ago. My hands trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the weight of everything that had just happened. I had imagined this moment for years, wondering what I'd say if life ever brought him back to me. And now that it had, I felt no victory, no joy, only the quiet justice of time. I walked back to my chair and sat down slowly. His folder was still on the desk. I opened it one last time, not to read, but to remind myself how far I'd come. The same man who once begged for mercy under a streetlight was now in control of a company worth millions. The same father who slept on a park bench now sat in an office lined with marble and glass. Yet, none of that felt as powerful as the moment I had just lived. The moment I saw the man who had broken me standing before me, broken himself. That was justice, not revenge. Revenge is loud, it burns fast. But justice, real justice, is quiet. It doesn't need to shout. It just waits patiently for life to complete its circle. I didn't destroy him. I didn't humiliate him. I simply let the truth stand in front of him, and it did all the work. The son who once mocked my poverty had now tasted it. The man who once laughed at my struggle now understood it. The voice that once told me I was useless now begged for mercy in the same tone I once used. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For a moment, I could still see that park bench, the cold night, the rain, the loneliness. But instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. That bench had been my beginning, not my end. It taught me more than any success ever could. It taught me the value of silence, the strength of patience, and the power of never letting cruelty define your future. Every night I spent there had built the man who now sat in that chair, a man who didn't need revenge because justice had already arrived. Later that evening, my secretary came in and asked if I wanted to process my son's application. I looked at her, smiled faintly, and said, "No. This company doesn't hire people who forget where they come from." She nodded and quietly took the file away. That was the end of it. No anger, no bitterness. Just closure. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw him again. But I heard things. That he found small jobs here and there. That he tried to rebuild his life. I hoped he would. Not because I wanted him to rise, but because I wanted him to understand what rising truly means. It's not about money. It's about respect. Respect for those who helped you stand before you could walk. Respect for the hands that built your comfort. That was the lesson he needed. The one that life, not I, had finally taught him. Sometimes, late at night, I would walk past the park again. The same bench was still there. I'd sit down on it for a few minutes, close my eyes, and let the wind hit my face. It felt different now. Not cold, not cruel. Just real. I would smile quietly, remembering the old man who once sat here, lost and hopeless. He wasn't dead. He just evolved. He became someone stronger, someone the world couldn't break again. People often ask me what success feels like. I tell them it's not the cars, the houses, or the bank accounts. Success is sitting on the same bench where you once cried and realizing you don't need revenge anymore. That the people who laughed at your pain now live with their own. That the circle of life always closes, not when you demand it, but when you've earned peace enough to watch it happen. That was my justice. Not the kind written in laws or spoken in courts, but the kind life writes quietly with time. The kind that doesn't destroy, it teaches. I didn't need to punish my son, life already had. And as I stood from that bench for the last time, I whispered softly to the wind, "You laughed when I fell. But when I rose, I did it so high you couldn't even see me anymore."